Welcome to the final session for today for FODI Digital, a weekend of online conversations about dangerous realities. I'm Simon Longstaff, Executive Director of the Ethics Centre and co-founder of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. As with so many other festivals around the world, our festival was brought to an end by a government that was concerned to protect the health and safety of the wider community. So this weekend we're picking up on some of the conversations that might have taken place, but also with the added pressure of COVID-19, which is bringing issues to the boil. Recently, Australians have been asked to download COVID Safe, an app that will help track and trace incidents of infection. A number of other countries have successfully done this, but of course after a number of data scandals in this country and abroad, people are justifiably nervous about whether or not the government should have access to data of this kind. So today we have a panel, and I'd ask you to direct your questions to them via the chat box in the course of the session, which will be chaired today by Dr. Matt Beard. Over to you, Matt.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Simon, and welcome to this final session of day one of Digital FODI States of Surveillance. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as well as the traditional custodians of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal land, where Ellen Broad, one of our panellists, is as well. Both Angie and Mark, our other panellists, are also on Gadigal land. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to whatever land you happen to be on, the traditional custodians and their unceded sovereignty over that land. So today we're talking about surveillance, and we're talking about it in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the 18th century, the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham came up with this idea that he called the panopticon. It was a prison where the guards were able to see the prisoners at all times, but the prisoners were never able to see the guards. And therefore they wouldn't know whether they were being watched at any moment in time or not. The effect of that was that they behaved at all times as though they were being watched. What Bentham cottoned onto was the fact that surveillance is a behaviour changing mechanism. Surveillance is power. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and the French philosopher Michel Foucault was looking at how much our modern prison system was driven by Bentham's ideas about the panopticon. But Foucault went further. He thought that the panopticon's terrible potential to control behaviour wasn't limited to prisons. He thought you could build a school based on the principles of the panopticon, a mental health institution, maybe even a public health system. Today, we're increasingly aware that someone might be watching what we're doing. In fact, many assume this is the case even when it's actually not. And for most of us, the idea of constant surveillance is most concerning when we're being watched by the power who can cut us off from welfare, who can lock us in prison. That is the state. We frequently point to mass surveillance in authoritarian regimes like China as a point of concern about what might happen if things go too far in a democracy. Or at least we did before the pandemic. Now, with an eye on public health rather than law enforcement or security, we've seen a really different conversation about surveillance play out. We've seen senior journalists and media commentators suggest that maybe we should take our lead from China, the very nation who we typically criticise when it comes to surveillance. So in this session, we're talking about technology, society, and surveillance during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. And I'm very lucky to be joined by Angie Abdilla, a Trawlwoolway woman from Tasmania, the CEO of Old Ways and New, and a researcher at the intersection of technology, culture, and humanity. We have Mark Pesce, a futurist, inventor, and broadcaster, and Ellen Broad, a senior fellow at the ANU's 3A Institute and the author of Made by Humans. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Mark, I want to start with you and just setting the scene, how we got here and where the conversation around surveillance has emerged from. It feels like today we're constantly talking about some new surveillance technology, whether it's metadata or facial recognition or machine learning and big data. Has it always been thus? have we always been watched or tracked or monitored? Or are we dealing with something new?
I guess it's probably a question of granularity more than almost anything else. Now, to bring it back to the moment that we're in now with COVID Safety app, the source code for that was released by the government last night. And I have two friends who have spent the day today sort of going through it bit by bit and taking a look at it. And what I'm listening to as I'm listening in on their conversation is them acknowledging all of the ways that all of our electronic systems already passively monitor where we are, what we're doing, versus the things that they might be doing actively. And one of the things that became clearer and clearer that no one's mentioned about COVID Safe is that every 2 hours it needs to basically ping back to the mothership to get a new magic key, which allows you to de-identify yourself so that you can be pinged by other phones and so that you can know where the contacts are being traced. That key changes every 2 hours for a means of security, but it also means you're checking in every 2 hours. And that means that there's metadata associated with that check-in. And we haven't thought about any of that. We thought about, it's helping us keep track of one another, but every single transaction we do on the web, every single transaction we do with the smartphone, all has that data associated with it. The government already passed laws that allows it to subpoena and use and store that data. So in some ways, we're now reaping the full harvest of everything that we've sown over the last, say, 25 years of the web, where we produced an infrastructure to deliver us information instantaneously. But that information, just in the act of asking for it, leaves a distinct trail, which becomes surveillance.
Right, and we're going to get into a little bit of discussion around the different ways in which COVID Safe could work in terms of whether it's centralized or decentralized and some of the ways of thinking through those trade-offs. But before we get there, Angie, we tend to talk today about surveillance only in a negative way, as an attack on freedoms and a potential weapon to preserve the power of the state. Is that the right way for us to think about surveillance and thinking about it in a different context now? Should we be inherently distrustful of surveillance?
Well, I guess if we wanted to just trace our minds back over the last 230 years, if we think about how the British arrived here in Australia and the various different types of technologies and, through policies and various and the tools that were used for settler people by the state to keep settler people so-called safe from Aboriginal people, what we see is a really long history, within Australia where Aboriginal peoples have been under constant surveillance. So should we trust the state? I guess from an Indigenous perspective, we've seen over time through the various different policies like the Aboriginal Protection Board, the Northern Territory Intervention, and now various different remote communities being locked down to keep the various different communities safe. I think that there's major issues of trust for various different minority communities within Australia that basically have never been able to experience just and equitable ways of living in this state.
And what's interesting about that is that you're talking about it there from a mode of surveillance that has at least formally been presented as we're doing this for you, like it's been inherently paternalistic. And there are some analogies there with the way in which the conversation around surveillance for the purposes of public health is playing out. Do you see similarities, maybe some differences in that?
Well, I guess you've got to ask the question: what are the intentions behind for the state to be surveying any of our peoples? And yes, on one hand, I understand we have we have a health concern, a pandemic that really, on one hand, doesn't, need a global response. However, I think what we're talking about here is a over 230 years of distrust with this particular nation state. So it's a tricky one. I mean, I think that a localized response has much more opportunity to be able to identify how we could, various different ways that communities could work with the government to solve these complex problems.
And I want to come back to that conversation about local versus federal responses a little bit later on. But before that, Ellen, I did want to check in with you, because one of the things that you alerted me to when we were talking is that surveillance means such a different thing. The term itself means such a different thing when we're talking in the context of public health, rather than what it means when we talk about security or law enforcement, where it really is largely about power and control. But when it comes to contact tracing, surveillance has a different and quite a specific meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah, and this was something that I wasn't aware of until I was listening to, for example, the updates from the Chief Medical Officer, and also talking to my public health colleagues here at the ANU, is on the one hand, I think surveillance quite often is about power and control. But when I talk to colleagues in a public health context, quite often what they're talking about having power over and controlling is not humans, it's the disease. So they're talking about surveilling a virus and controlling and breaking the chains of transmission of a virus. And this really struck me because, as you said, in a national security context, you usually never want to say what you're doing is surveillance, or you would, but a lot of the kinds of services that we talk about that are increasingly using digital technologies, Mark alluded to the use of metadata, you try to avoid using the word surveillance because of the connotations it has. So to hear colleagues in a public health context use it quite openly because their eyes are not necessarily on individuals, they are on a virus, which I found really interesting to observe.
Yeah, there's a big distinction to be made between something that it's appropriate to control and something that has agency and autonomy of its own, where arguably it's less appropriate to use those kinds of mechanisms. And I have to play philosopher here for a second. Oh, jump in, Ellen.
No, I was just going to say, I just realized contact tracers are also very concerned with how and what people do after they've been diagnosed with a virus. So there is an element, I should clarify, there's definitely an element of surveillance and control of people, such that when a contact tracer tells you, hey, you've come into contact with someone who has COVID-19, they really want you to do as they say and self-isolate, quarantine for the prescribed number of days. So it is, I should make clear that there is an element of human control as well.
Yeah, and I think this is what's interesting about this when we merge this with technology. So to play philosopher a second, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who we should be skeptical of because he was a Nazi, but also had some interesting ideas about technology, thought that one of the things that happened when we started to develop modern technology as opposed to older forms of technology was that we changed our approach from something that was about trying to reveal the world around us as it was, to an approach that was about trying to inframe or shape or control the world and bend it to our will, which means that there's this kind of logic of control that's built into our approach to technology today generally. So Angie, if that's true, and today a lot of the technological approaches that we see coming out of places like Silicon Valley rely on some particular approaches. They rely on extraction and commodification and individualism. So if all of that is built into the kind of logic and the background philosophy of how we think about technology, is this kind of surveillance, whatever the context, is that kind of like a natural endpoint to some of this?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on who you're talking to, but I think there's a significant amount of people now that recognize that data is valued, well, the value of data exceeds oil now. And so I guess it's also dependent on how the value is also dependent on how you extract it. So with oil, of course, it's for its energy, and for data, of course, it's for power, knowledge and power. And so when we're thinking about, the types of technologies and the types of surveillance and the types of data collection that we're seeing right now, I guess, outside of the context of COVID and the COVID app, but also including the context of the COVID app, Aboriginal communities are often situated in some of the most minerally rich areas across this continent. So it's no surprise that there's some really problematic issues here with the way in which the federal government have been locking down communities as opposed to enabling an Indigenous-led response for those communities to determine who comes in, who comes out, what resources are required in and out, what is the right types of methods for both identifying and isolating infection. And, so yeah, I think, yes, there are most technologies now, both privatized and those developed by the state, I think do have the end point is always about maintaining control. Knowledge, power, control, data is the issue here.
Mark, I want to ask you about COVID safe, but before I do, as an inventor, as someone who builds stuff, taking on board some of the criticisms that Angie's made there, like if you're going to approach design taking some of those perspectives in mind, does it change your approach when you look back on some of the ways in which things have been built in the past that you've been connected to, that you've been involved in? Can you see how there might have been shortcomings in the approach that's been taken, where something that was a bit more locally grounded in the way that Angie's describing would have real value?
The web was originally supposed to be very decentralized, and it is still in a lot of ways in that everyone has their own website, but still, because of the capital concentrations that happened as it developed an advertising model, and as the advertising model then developed into a surveillance model, and as the surveillance model then developed into a profiling model and all of this, you started to get all of this other structure in there that was quite top down. And so you really have this overwhelming top-down organizing force that's really trying to sort of put its stamp on the bottom-up organizing force. And you can even see this with the track and trace apps, because Apple and Google have amazingly created their own technology for this, which is remarkably decentralized, remarkably preserving of privacy in all of these situations. Whereas you have Singapore and now Australia with COVID Safe, which is basically a translation of the Singapore app, going for a model that's more top down. And so it has some privacy concern around it. So you can see in pretty much every major technology that we get to, you always have different approaches. You can have bottom-up approaches that affiliate, that look for individuals to have agency, or you can have top-down approaches which basically allow you to click through an agreement that assigns all your rights to a commercial entity, and then you're done.
Ellen, I want to bring you in here just on the discussion around Apple and Google's approach here, because I remember when we were talking earlier, you was slightly frustrated with the fact that they had come in at the last minute with this wonderful privacy-preserving app, and yet bear so much responsibility for the context in which a general distrust of technology is taking place.
Yes, it did seem like this is a great opportunity to salvage reputation somewhat, knowing that kind of part of the challenges that we have developed over the last decade or so is because of the devices that we carry in our pockets all of the time, which facilitate so many different forms of data-hungry services collecting information about us. So that was somewhat ironic to me. Probably more fundamentally, though, I think I've been troubled by number one, that you can have the two largest device manufacturers on the planet combined to support the same infrastructure. That's like a fairly significant effect on the use of smartphones worldwide. It's kind of a monopolistic practice, or perhaps is a monopolistic practice, but it also, so Mark alluded to the fact that the solution that Apple and Google have collaborated on is essentially a decentralized solution. So rather than having any government authority who is like the Singapore solution or like the Australian solution, in the event a person tests positive and consents to uploading their data to a server managed by the government, they take on decrypting that information and they store it in a central database. The Google Apple solution sees that infrastructure being totally decentralized, as Mark suggested. But what troubles me about that is not so much the infrastructure itself, but that is not just a change in infrastructure, that essentially forces a change in the way each sovereign country would undertake contact tracing. And I feel as though we are talking a lot about the privacy implications of centralized versus decentralized solutions, but perhaps not nearly as much about what it means for private enterprises to be able to make changes to the way each individual country would utilize technologies for contact tracing. I just feel like there's something quite profound about that isn't getting enough airtime.
Mark, do you want to jump in on
Matt,
this?
We actually saw this. We saw this in play this week, and the German government was planning on doing their own contact tracing app, and basically decided that they were going to browbeat themselves into accepting the Google Apple model. So you saw a large sovereign nation decide that it really couldn't do it itself, that it needed to do the thing that the tech giants were telling it to do.
And the thing that drives me, the thing that frustrates me about that is this is still an experimental technology. So this is not only a sovereign countries now having to take on an Apple Google solution, it's actually not yet, I mean, this is the first pandemic we've ever tried to use proximity-based contact tracing in. We actually have no idea whether it even works. So now you have all of these countries who, if they want to utilize proximity-based contact tracing, are forced into a solution that hasn't been tested. And we're not sure yet what the implications would be of this solution for members of the public.
And of course, adding to that, the fact that neither the government nor some of these large tech organizations have been particularly good at thinking about a diverse group of users and the range of effects, both direct and indirect, that those are going to have on people and on groups. And when they're rolling out something that's experimental, the effects and the downsides of that experiment don't necessarily flow to all of us in equal manner. Just drilling down a little bit more on COVID safe, Mark, when I'm talking to tech designers, one of the things that I really like to challenge them on is what I call the Death Star challenge. You know, what would happen if you found out that the work that you were doing, you know, inadvertently was contributing to the construction of the Death Star? Now, I wonder if you've been thinking a little bit about that question recently, because it turns out you have a very personal history with the development of Bluetooth proximity tracking technology. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you're thinking about is different about your experiences about 15 years ago to what's happening today?
In 2005, 2006, I worked on, and this is before the smartphone, I worked on using Bluetooth, which was just showing up in the feature phones at the time, to be able to listen to all of the other phones around them. And we did a big art installation at a show called IZEA, which is a big international electronic art expo. It was in San Jose, California that year. And we set up a program that people could run on their phones, but was also running around the exhibition area that was listening to everyone's Bluetooth and watching how people associated. We basically listened and built a database of contacts up. And then people could walk over to the installation site and they could actually see that we had built a social graph. And it was before the term had really come into common use, but the same way you think of your network of friends on Facebook or on Twitter or on LinkedIn, whatever it might be, we were able to do that just by listening to how people were hanging out together, because their Bluetooth signals would be in proximity to one another when we were listening. And this is essentially exactly how the COVID Safe app works and all of the other Bluetooth-based tracking and tracing apps work. So fast forward 15 years, and we now see this technology being used toward a different end. And it's at some level, social tracing via Bluetooth, that's exactly the same as it was before. It's got this other element that it's now basically being delivered by a government. It may be toward a good end in that if it can slow the infection and help people trace chains of infection, that's going to be a very good thing. But it means that we're now seeing this as a technology of surveillance. Really, at the time, even though it was there, we didn't forward that. We said, oh, this is this fun way that we can just sort of watch the environment we're in. And that tells you that the way we were thinking about surveillance in 2005 and 2006 is very different than the way we're thinking about surveillance today.
I want to ask both Angie and Ellen in that order. If Mark runs that art project at a conference that you're at today, do you sign up and get involved in that project or not?
I guess as an individual, knowing Mark, yes. If it was different context, probably no. If it's the government, no. That's my quick answer.
Ellen?
Yes, I have to do other things with Mark, so of course my answer is going to be yes. But no, I've participated in art projects like this, and what I find really interesting about art projects, although Mark, I don't quite know if you said you did this or not, but quite often art projects utilizing technologies like this today have their own consent processes as soon as you engage with the project. So similarly, in the context of art, probably when I feel least worried.
And that's interesting, because both of you have said that relationship that you have to Mark forms, and that kind of existing trust that you have is a really crucial piece of the puzzle there. We're going to talk about the trust context and how that affects COVID Safe in a moment. But just before we do, Ellen, we've got a couple of questions coming through that are about the decisions that people make about relinquishing their data or not relinquishing their data. And I think that's one of the things that people are bearing in mind, is the things that they might not be aware of when they make a choice to either hold on to their data or not hold on to their data. And what they might not be aware of, but are also conscious of, is that there's a trade-off being made there between kind of different goods. And that's a trade-off that we're talking about a lot when we think about, say, COVID Safe in the context of a centralized approach where all of the information flows to a central place, so it all sits in one place. And there might be some additional benefits that can be had by having that data in a centralized way and being able to analyze that if that's the approach that's taken. But then a decentralized approach keeps everyone's data and information private, but means that there's less you can do and less value that you can obtain from the kind of collectivized approach. So when we're dealing with these trade-offs between kind of collective benefit and privacy, or whatever the goods are at stake, like, how do we think through those things at such scale?
So I think you're absolutely right that we're in negotiations about the use of our data all the time. I think the problem in some contexts when we talk about trade-offs is we don't have the power to make trade-offs. There are negotiations that we should have power to have. So that might be negotiations about the extent to which information is shared about us when we use many of the other kinds of applications in our phones that collect information. There are choices that we could have and we're not given. There are also contexts, and public health is one of those contexts, within which we exchange information about ourselves in direct care situations so that we can get better care. So we accept that in order to have better care for ourselves, we need to reveal information about ourselves. And in the context of a disease outbreak, the negotiation that we have is such that we reveal information about ourselves in the event we test positive for COVID-19, so that people around us, our family, our friends, our communities can be protected. So we have these negotiations all the time. One of the things that I think we're wrestling with at the moment in the context of COVID-19 is, on the one hand, for example, if you do download COVID Safe, you still choose to consent whether you share that information from your device in the event you test positive for COVID-19. So at the moment, in terms of in legislation, there is no compulsion for you to share information. Although we do know there's already been context within which the downloading of COVID Safe has been coerced. So we're still kind of in a slippery slope. But I think when I hear conversations about trade-offs and what we should and shouldn't relinquish, what strikes me is that quite often contexts within which we're most concerned about trade-offs, because it's such a sensitive area like healthcare, we also need to reveal something about ourselves in order to get the care we need. What I don't hear us talking enough about are the contexts within which we should be able to negotiate trade-offs. I remember a decade ago being in conversations with search engines about why we weren't facilitating any low-cost models that would be privacy-preserving models. So, for example, if you sign up for a Google account, is there a paid model that would facilitate some protection over your data such that it couldn't be used for advertising? And it was just seen as not economically interesting or viable. There are trade-offs we could make, but we're not given the ability to make them. That's just the status quo.
And one of the things that people
within government.
Go ahead, Angie. Did you want to say more on that?
Yeah, I guess just off the back of that, Ellen, I think likewise, with the differences between the privatized tool tech platforms and state-based platforms, there's a really critical need for very diverse communities to be able to identify what types of information they'd like to share with the types of entities. So there's a hell of a lot of Indigenous-run health organisations and community-led healthcare that I know. Well, I'm pretty confident that a lot of Aboriginal communities would feel really confident in being able to share that information, whether it be interpersonally or through a tool, a platform that was potentially designed and developed for those communities in mind.
One of the things that that jumps out to me there is how heavily the kind of the scale of the Googles and Facebooks has set our context for what we think are the kinds of choices we've already made about our information, therefore what choices we should make going forward. So you hear all the time people saying, well, you share so much more information with Google and Facebook and Apple than you're going to share by downloading COVID Safe, and therefore there's no reason for you to have these kinds of privacy concerns. But Mark, one of the things that we talked about is the extent to which that understates the difference between interacting with an organization and how we interact and relate to the state, which is exactly what Angie was just mentioning there.
Yeah, Facebook and Google can be guaranteed to have their commercial interests at heart, and that they will prioritize their commercial interests before your interests and before the state's interests and before anyone else's interests. However, with COVID Safe, this is literally an app which is providing data directly to the government. The government has the monopoly on the use of force and all of the other sort of slightly disguised means of force, so cutting you off from benefits or subjecting you to quarantine, whatever it might be, even in the name of public health. There are, I guess, constraints there. And when we say that we're willing to click the box that assigns all our rights to Google or to Facebook or to Twitter because we want to use those services and engage in that negotiation around those services, we are implicitly understanding that there is a limit to the damage that they can cause, and that we're okay with that. And I feel as though, in a lot of ways, we respect the power of the state to the degree that we know that it can cause us a lot more damage than we're really willing to sustain. And therefore, any relationship that we have with them has to be framed around that.
And that's where we need to think about the trust context. We know there's a lot of information to suggest that, generally there's distrust in government at the moment. There's distrust in most major institutions, although it does vary based on what kind of government institution you're talking about. But what usually happens is that there's a straight line relationship between, well, I don't trust the government, therefore I'm not going to give them my data, end of conversation. But Ellen, you think that should be the starting point for an investigation about what we can do about that situation of distrust?
Yeah, so I know that trust in government is directly tied to the health of our public institutions, and that an anti-government kind of philosophy, one that kind of values small government, fewer interventions in the lives of citizens, also benefit from a narrative that argues government cannot be trusted in any technical context as well. I'm torn because I also appreciate that there are a number of contexts in our lives where we rely on public services, whether that is in a healthcare context, or whether that is in a social services support context. What I find, the conversation that I think we need to be having is about how do we fund mechanisms to ensure that information that we share in a government context cannot be abused or cannot be misused. One of the ways that we can ensure that it isn't used against us or isn't used, for example, something that you provide in a COVID-19 context ends up being used in a compliance context. So to withhold your welfare payments, for example, that is the exact kind of use that would prevent someone or make someone very reluctant to share information for a public health purpose in the first place. But we don't have well-funded mechanisms funded by taxpayers to ensure that that kind of misuse doesn't take place. We've had conversations about a federal anti-corruption body for some time. We've had conversations about increased funding for existing offices like our Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, but we don't have like strong funding for independent authorities who could help to ensure that abuse doesn't take place.
I want to talk a little bit in the 5 minutes that we have left about the messaging that's accompanied the rollout of the COVID Safe app. Angie, there's been a pretty nationalistic and jingoistic tone to some of the conversation that downloading and using the app is a marker of good citizenship. Earlier, before there was a discussion of the app, we had the Prime Minister saying that the way to get through the pandemic was for Australians to keep being Australians. But of course, who counts as an Australian has always been a culturally loaded term. It's been politically loaded. There are some people who have very good reasons for not downloading COVID Safe, and yet we wouldn't want to think of them as bad citizens as a result, like people who the app interferes with their diabetes tracking, for example. What happens, generally speaking, when we're talking about technology, when we build in all of these cultural values and messages and assumptions?
Yeah, it was really, really dangerous, I think. I mean, first and foremost, as you mentioned in the acknowledgement of country, that Aboriginal people have not ceded sovereignty. And so, I mean, currently right now, you know, if we want to talk about the nation and state, it really depends on who you're talking to. From an Indigenous perspective, that's actually a much deeper, more complex question. But I think that in relation to the role of the state and proposing that you to be part of this society, you need to give up your rights to be a good citizen is it's certainly problematic. I think that sovereignty is an interesting thing. You know, we have 250 sovereign nations across this continent, and if we want to talk about how we support sovereign peoples and their rights and responsibilities to each other and to this country in its deeper sense, then there's a whole wealth of knowledge and experience that we can draw upon, Indigenous governance and international relations that have occurred here on this continent for thousands and thousands of years, which have been highly successful in being able to manage really complex situations that have happened over time, over deep time. So I think what we're talking about here is differences in Western ideas and values of governance and Indigenous ideas of values and governance that we really should start to open up as to have a valued place within these much more complex conversations around the role of technology and the state into the future.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that there's been some reporting around some remote Indigenous communities who have anticipated early the threat of the pandemic and responded really effectively to that before any kind of federal approach was taken place. As a last comment, I want to throw this to Mark and Ellen. There's this law that you both be familiar with called Amara's law, the idea that technology is always overestimated in the short term and then underestimated in the long term in terms of its power and influence. So I want to ask Ellen to talk about the ways in which we might be overestimating COVID Safe in the short term, thinking about it as sunblock or some kind of a protective tool, and Mark about some of the ways in which we might be underestimating the long-term impacts of what this new kind of mechanism and approach to surveillance might be going forward. So let's start with Ellen.
So I know that I've been getting frustrated about the use of language like sunblock or sunscreen to describe the protection COVID Safe gives us, because it's not a barrier to getting COVID-19. At a very practical level, when we talk about how we overestimate what's possible with an app like COVID Safe, it's not only do we overestimate it in terms of things like it actually being some kind of physical shield or some physical barrier to contracting the virus, but we're also in danger of overestimating how practically it works, so how useful it is within enclosed spaces, how useful it is as a mechanism for contact tracing full stop. There's a number of practical questions to work through about using COVID Safe. But I know Mark will go to the question of how we underestimate it. I know that it nonetheless sets a precedent that we need to think about in the longer term.
And I think in that longer term, what we're really going to have to be aware of is that we will change our behavior, as you pointed out, Matt, in the beginning, to the degree that we feel that we are being watched. And when the crisis ends, when the acute crisis passes into the chronic crisis, and then the chronic crisis goes away because we have a vaccine or effective treatments or who knows what in some future that we actually can't even see yet. And we're going to be left with the residue, not just of the data created by these apps, but the precedent of having used these apps to solve a problem for social good. That is going to have left a dent in the fabric of reality, to misquote Steve Jobs, that's going to be very easy to slide other things back into. And so we need to be looking very critically at everything we're doing now, why we're doing it, who's doing it, and how it's being used in every aspect, not just today, but tomorrow and the day after, because that will allow us to have a full accounting of the decisions that we might want to make in the world ahead.
Could I just add to that, because there's something that the app has. It was very quick, Matt, but just to Mark's point, one thing that this has facilitated and is a precedent is this is the first time someone's told us to download an app and 5 million people have said, okay, you've told us to do something and we'll do it, irrespective of there being a law that compels us to do it. And that, as a gesture, does set a precedent for potential futures within which employers ask us to download certain apps, or health insurers ask us to download apps, irrespective of this particular app in this context. I think the fact that we've been told to do something, downloading something to our device, and we've done it, is a form of precedent setting that we need to think about.
And that brings us to the end of the time that we have. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Angie Abdilla, Ellen Broad, Mark Pesce. I would encourage you, if this conversation has whet your appetite, Angie Abdilla's edited volume, Decolonizing the Digital, is definitely something you should investigate. Ellen's book, Made by Humans, equally is something worth exploring. And Mark's book, Augmented Reality, is out, I think, in September. So keep an eye out for that as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please come back for day 2 of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas tomorrow. It is Mother's Day as well. So if you haven't gotten your mum flowers yet, you have about 12 hours. And happy Mother's Day to all of the mums who might be tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us, again, to our panelists, and for you at home for listening along.
Thanks for joining us. Look, I hope you can join us tomorrow when we look at a whole set of new issues to do with politics, health, and what the future might be in a post-pandemic world. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas and FODI Digital is presented by the Ethics Centre. Our purpose is to bring ethics to the centre of everyday life through public experiences, education, thought leadership, advocacy, consulting, and leadership programs. As a non-profit organisation, every single dollar is invested in pursuit of this purpose. Thanks to our donors and partners who help to make our programs happen. And you can donate via the website. Thank you.